want to start with a big thank you to our hosts, Johannes and somewhere, okay, and Nathan now finally arrived, and everything is Nathan's fault. So I feel a little bit like an imposter, but you kindly invited me and to give what you call the remix or so of a talk I gave at SOAS a long time ago. The problem I have is, so I really like to talk about that, but so it's possible that because meanwhile I published a small article on something that I'm planning to make a small book. So the article is out and it's possible that some of you know part of that, but I believe I'm framing it differently this time. So I hope it's still worth listening to, and otherwise you might just go for a walk. And then I will read a little bit for the first part. To manage time better, and then I can go into more detail of the material. I hope it will become clear what I'm trying to talk about. So, and speaking of clear, I'll try to explain a few of the concepts that I'm using in the title, and let me start with, so I'm using the arrow keys, but nothing. Spacebar? Spacebar? No. What did you do? Okay. Okay, now it works. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry. Okay, so I want to explain a few terms that are used in the title. And here, this is a rough scheme. I was just thinking a bit, okay, so what do I mean by legibility and reader competence? It's really just, I wonder how much readers needed to know when they were using early Chinese manuscripts. And then also, of course, that helps me understand, how much the manuscripts were used at all for the purpose of reading. So roughly distinguishing this, I guess the first thing is you have to identify the character, and that means, components, the structure of the character, but sometimes even individual strokes. So clarity of writing plays a role. On the next level, you need to identify what words the characters are writing, and that concerns orthography. And then if you're using the text for example, reciting the text, but even reading for yourself, it needs a certain speed so you can actually understand what's going on. It cannot be a complete crossword puzzle slow experience. I think at a certain point, it breaks down, what we call the purpose of reading. And then on a higher level, I'd say you also want to understand the structure of a text and know, what its in component parts are. And then also you want to understand what the text is trying to say or what it is used for socially. Okay, and now I'm getting a little bit even more fundamentalist here to a more basic level. And that is, I was trying to understand, because I'm assuming there's a lot of oral textual culture going on at the time, and yet all we have is written texts, right? So I was trying to think about that. And now this is my reading part. So I believe language, whether spoken and heard or being written and being read, always has a temporal extension, while written text alone inhabits space. So books take up space in our house, but they only begin to take up time when we actually read them. We may not always give much thought to the fact that spoken texts need to unfold in time and that the written representation collapses that temporal extension. Once the act of writing is completed, the written text from beginning to end inhabits the same moment of time, each moment of its existence. The language represented by a text regains its temporal extension when it's being read. The relationship between the duration of a spoken text and its written representation seems fairly unproblematic. Knowing our typical speed of reading, a glance at the spatial extension of a text, its layout and font size, allows us to estimate the time needed for reading. But the continuity of a text on a screen makes this impossible. Hence, the information the New York Times offers in its electronic version, while the print version leaves it out as unnecessary. In our time of predominant silent reading, we tend to think about the relationship between the spoken text extending in time and its visual representation extending in space as linear. Assuming a more or less constant speed of reading, we expect a relatively constant visual density of the written text. Not so with music, in which the change of tempo is a much more prominent feature than in spoken language. Here, we expect to recognize a quicker succession of short notes immediately by the density of the notation on the page. When language accompanies music, we are perfectly used to extreme changes in the speed in which syllables are pronounced. And the length of syllables has to be shown in writing if words and notes are matched on the same page. The tempo and rhythm of language is dictated by the music, but often enough the music is written in a way that underscores the meaning of the words. Recitation of a text without music, especially poetry, uses changes in tempo in a similar way. And I found this rather well said in a documentary that I recently watched of the translator Red Pine, who said, "The words on a page are not the poem, they're the recipe, not the meal. Steps drawn on a dance floor, not the dance." And yeah, so I really came to like this. It wasn't necessary, but I wanted to cite that. So even in silent reading of a prose text, the idea of constant tempo turns out to be an illusion once we consider it in more detail. We pause to take in an idea, process an emotion, or take a mental note. Considering that early Chinese manuscripts interacted with a probably predominantly oral textual culture, I'm interested in indications that written texts give us of their probable use. Were they read at all, or just meant to visually represent a text and its prestige? Were they read aloud to an audience or used in other ways as part of oral communication situations? Indications can be found in various features of manuscripts, reaching from layout and script features that reduce textual density to abbreviations that increase textual density. That's why my considerations about time and space here. I will probably just have time for the latter aspect. So, and now it comes to the punctuation part that has been mostly published, the ideas of this. So in earlier discussions, so these are the publications I was mentioning. In earlier discussions of punctuation, I found two deficiencies that needed to be addressed. The discussion usually focused narrowly on marks, in Chinese, 符号. And these marks were referred to in part by their function and in part by their form. And that sort of bothered me, it didn't seem a good system. And here, these two articles. In the first one, I compared punctuation devices in the two Mawang de Silk manuscripts that both have also text of the Laozi. And I concluded that probably one of them was really much used for reading on different levels, not just punctuation alone, is why I concluded that. And the other one, probably not so much, was probably mostly a representational object. So, and in the second publication, I advocated for a broad concept of punctuation, largely consistent with the definition given by the Latin paleographer Julian Brown. Punctuation is the use of spacing, conventional signs, and certain typographical devices as aids to the understanding and correct reading, both silently and aloud, of handwritten and printed text. And I'm aware that later literature is not necessarily comparable completely with early Chinese pieces, but it seemed a very good general approach. And then I distinguished these three areas of punctuation: spacing and layout, script features like capitalization, italics, and so forth, and then non-alphanumeric, that obviously comes from alphabetical writing, but you know what I mean, non-characters that write language, elements, so that we usually call marks. So I think that's my important point here, that we have to look at all three, especially if we look at historical materials. Okay, and why that is so is because I think historically, or I'm sure historically, the functions that these devices perform, they transition from one area to the other, right? And that's why it's not a good idea to just look at marks and think we're getting the full story, because we'll also always miss the other parts, or we're just dealing with them intuitively, which is never a good idea. I mean, that's a problem about the materiality of writing, why it's often overlooked, because we deal with that level of things intuitively in our life, because we kind of grow into that culture. But if you look at a distant culture, it's better to be conscious of that, obviously. Okay, and now I want to just to show a few obvious examples of how that is not really far-fetched. So you're all familiar with that, not really great for reading. So you would need a lot of competence here to figure that out, especially in a reasonable time frame, right? If you wanted to read that. Whereas here with word spacing, no problem, but you might still stumble and not enunciate things really well. And then that's how this part gets published. And I borrowed that from Malcolm Parks's book on punctuation. And here I just showed that to make the point that even synchronically, we use all those areas. So there are spacing and layout, mostly the word spacing, sentence spacing. Then there's script features like capitalization and italics, all having their own functions, often more than one. And then we have lots of marks and also, of different kinds performing different functions. So no need to explain much more. Here's another piece of, just because I was there in Rome and I took a few photos. And I found it interesting that a lot of phenomena that I see in early manuscripts also occur in Western writing. But anyway, so you have scriptio continua and not quite easy to read, also not very hard because there's not a lot of text and you figure it out somehow, right? People also can develop skills, obviously, to read things that are difficult for us who don't live in that culture. But at the same time, I found it really interesting that, there is a little bit of almost spacing and it's completely in the wrong places, only based on what shape the characters have, right? So it can be tricky, but no time. So let's move on. Here, I want to make the point that actually the function transitions from one of those areas to the other. Like, we have word spacing by punctus, and then we have word spacing just, by space without marks. And we have Gerwen in this text too, right? The and the references and so forth. Okay, and interestingly, I also found, what we use on the computer every day. If you don't switch it off, you have the punctus between the words, right? And you have the paragraph symbols, and then when you print it out, they're gone. So we live with that. And then in more modern ways of writing, we have spacing and compounds disappearing, being replaced by internal capitalization, a script feature. Or you have a transition of letters and other script features to marks. So the paragraph marking, maybe I shouldn't go through all the details, or italics, when we still use typewriters before the computer, you could use marks or underlining to replace that. And then the printers would use the italics. And now I need water. So yeah, an example that I really like is the umlaut, right? Because it's a superscript E. And then when you write the Gothic E, it has these prominent ascenders, and then they look almost like strokes, and then you make it 2 strokes, and then you can also use 2 dots, and that's how things develop, right? Okay, this is an interesting one that I'm owing to a book by the German typographer. Is that even a word? A Tschichold, who collected all the ampersands in the universe. I really like that. But anyway, here this function starts with the Turonian notes. So you have a non-alphanumeric thing. You have a mark that stands for et, right? And then you can combine it here on the right-hand side. Do I know how to use this pointer? Is that? Yeah, okay. So you can write a C after that. So you have mark plus letter, and that gives you etc. And then you also can use it in the same text, right? You have the Turonian note for et, and then you have the ET for et. And you have all sorts of ways of writing et. And, anyway, I just like this. And I think, but here my main point is that the letters really turn into something that's more like a sign, because you use them in all sorts of languages and you don't think of the Latin or any other et necessarily if your language has a different word for and, right? Then it just becomes second nature. And is that visible? Yeah. And I found a parallel here that Peter Ziemer, I think, wrote this article on Uyghur manuscripts, where you have Liao Ye written as a ligature in a non-Chinese text. And it ends with the Chinese ligature saying, well, we're done. It's the end of the text. So, and this I needed to show you because I came across it. daytime cocktail bar, so I didn't get in. And you have the and represented by something that looks like the ampersand, right? But it's really a cocktail pick with an orange twist. So, I just like that. And so also, I'm not just doing this to entertain myself, because I really do believe in always trying to sort of broaden my horizon in that, or just not stay in the conventional limits of thinking about something, because then you can often see something that you'd otherwise miss, right? Even in manuscript, because I don't know what the people in early China did to amuse themselves, right? So anyway, so moving on. The semantic value of punctuation, I don't think I need to explain much here. So that's fairly established that in a more oral textual culture. So, or, before silent reading, I don't want to make this too mechanical, right? But there is more of a rhetorical principle in punctuation, and then more silent reading often leads to more syntactical, logical approach of the sentence here, the sentences and so forth. And then there are cultural differences. So I believe in English, punctuation strikes me as a little bit more rhetorical in nature sometimes, not just the logic of the text. German tends to be very rigorous or more rigorous in punctuating according to the logic of the grammar. So, okay, I'll skip this entirely. Who punctuated? No time for this today. These are just a few examples of how Chinese scholarship on punctuation really evolved in a very positive way, in my perception. So it really started with that mix that bothered me of morphological and functional criteria, and then it got increasingly consistent, and the most refined concept that I found so far is Chongpeng Wan, and he is really consistent in using functional criteria, and then sometimes he gives us the morphological subdivisions within one function. So again, very helpful. I needed one more concept, or I came across it and I found it useful, and that is what Jeffrey Nunberg calls text category indicators. So, and here, I think that's good for Chinese manuscripts to distinguish delimiters, beginning and end, easy. Then distinguishers that, like we use italics, for example, for a word of a different language within a text. And, but there can be other distinctive properties that you want to have, for example, headlines or something. And that's often in early Chinese manuscripts, I've seen a lot of remarks that this was written by a different hand. And I think, no, I mean, the New York Times title page doesn't mean it's a different person who does that. You just need a distinguisher here, right? And there are examples for that. Separators are a tricky thing to explain, because you can always say, well, if you separate two parts, isn't that also then the initiator terminator function? But I think it's something else, and it has to do with how much a text that is a compilation of smaller units is meant to be a coherent text or not. But anyway, that would be a different talk to give. So, and this is basically where I ended up. And yeah, okay, I hope I've explained the usefulness a bit. The point 3 here leads a bit far, but I think it's involved in the story and would unhelpfully limit what we look at if we left it out. I'm just saying that because I've heard so many remarks, and I do understand about, well, that's not punctuation, what you're talking about, right? But what we call punctuation also is not just the punctus in text, right? I mean, obviously. So it's not as such clear what you're allowed to call punctuation or not. So that's why I want to have that very broad concept. Okay. Still, okay. Okay, thank you. So now I'm getting a bit closer to reader competence. And again, here, I'm mostly asking questions, so I don't have results to present. And most of that is fairly familiar. But I'm just trying to think really of the practicality of a reader reading these things, and how much do you need to bring to that manuscript? Because I feel I'm missing a bit, and it's, okay, so it's getting more present or visible in the discussions of early manuscripts, whether people read them a lot and all that, and how they were used. But I still think I'm sometimes missing that stronger element of at least trying to understand how did it actually work, and not just us deciphering and then knowing the text, right? So to me, an important question is, how much did the reader already know the text, right? What was the function? How often may it have been the case that a written text served the function to facilitate someone's first acquaintance with the text? And that's often what we do. We go to a bookshop, we buy that book, and we read it, right? And we've never seen that before. And I think it might just be really different in early China in many cases. Okay, getting started, that seems a totally easy thing. So how you repeat the character, fine. But I mean, here you also needed first, the reader needed to know not only that you use Wei to, for what we use Hua as a phonetic today, but then, well, you probably learned that, right? So like any other character. So I don't think that's a big deal. But you also needed to understand, if you see the repetition mark, that it's not a Hewen mark, right? That this wasn't meant to say Hua Xin or something, right? So it's already, you need to understand what the text is trying to communicate. Still easy. This one is very well known, so I guess readers may have, in this particular example, totally known that by the formulaic nature of the phrase, so and so, and fine. But this one, you already needed to figure out that you don't read AABB, but you read ABAB. But still fairly simple, right? Here, this comes from the Qin dynasty didactic text manuscript, broadly speaking, Wei Li Zhidao, modern title, given in hindsight. So just one section, there are 3 catalogs of 5 faults of, I guess, an official, yeah, it says an official, 立有五失, right? 5 deficiencies, and you have 2 catalogs that just give you the deficiency, and the third one is more complex. It has a cause and effect relationship. So first, not scrutinizing whom you employ nearby. If you do not scrutinize whom you employ nearby, discontent will come up instantly. So a couple of things are interesting to me. One is, it's not the catalog itself that rhymes, because, the question for me was, did someone first write down the 5 faults and then add as an explanation what happens when you have those deficiencies, right? But then I would expect the first part to be rhymed, right? So it seems to me that this thing was conceptualized from the beginning as cause and effect expression, right? So the effect part rhymes. Again, not a big deal necessarily. Another interesting thing is that you have 5 sets of those, and only the first 3 members of the catalog work with this repetition, at least with a repetition mark. But I'm assuming the reader was expected to understand, having done it 3 times, that in 4 and 5, you do that as well. But it is oddly irregular anyway in terms of meter, and so, right? So it's hard to say, right? I cannot be sure that it was meant to read this way. Why this is important to me, and I don't know if I have time to get to this part, is that something that gets similar to the Jing-Shuo structure, and that in modern pedagogy we would call chunking of information to keep cognitive load, within a certain limit and distribute information gradually, right? That this is applied here. So I would assume it's applied in all 5 cases. Okay. Here it gets a little bit more demanding, I feel. So the text wuxing is very logical somehow, and I think that helps any reader probably, right? But you do need to understand that you have this A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and you need to read A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, H, and so forth. That takes a little bit of processing, I think. And I wouldn't want to be the person to be given the manuscripts and you recite it to an audience right now, and you've never seen it before. One thing that just excited me when I was in Hunan in the museum and looked at this Ma Wangdui manuscript was 凡事行不敢惊天 天下, right? So you have that double repetition mark, right? So it says you have to read the Tian 3 times, and that's rather rare. I'm still hunting for more examples. But anyway, it was just nice to see it. But again, a reader needs to figure it out. Here's something that I also used to still call Zhongwen Hao, and I don't have very strong feelings if that's wrong or not, but I think I learned from Cheng on one that 声带符 might be a good way of describing some of those. So it's a substitution, and you have a regular catalog. I think that's fairly easy, but still you also need to learn all those things as a reader. 是为什么什么 and so forth. And then it's not the 是 that gets repeated, but this sort of complementary, or whatever is a good word for that, other word that you expect after 为. And it's very similar in Jinggongyue, where you have 内重右会前外重右两秋句, right? So what am I trying to say here? That's the similar principle. It got a little bit trickier, and you see by the fact that people first misunderstood it in Mingxun, where you have, God, where is the thing with the repetition mark? Ah, here, okay. So the magenta part, you don't see my cursor, sorry, that didn't work. So this part here, right? So you would expect Da Ming Shi Fa, Shao Ming, then Ming Shen, and that's how it was first read. And here it's also not Da Ming Shi Fa, Shao Ming Shi Shen, right? But it's, you need to recognize which word is the corresponding notion. I mean, I'm not saying it's that difficult, right? But again, you don't want to be surprised by these things when you read them. Now let's get to a bit of Hewen. To me, this is something that I don't want to present on today, but to me, it's a very interesting question of what do you consider one word? You know, did that reflect somehow people were thinking about two things as, you know, we consider wine glass a word normally, but broken glass 2 words and so forth. And people need to form ideas about that. And I think Hewen sometimes could reflect something of how people were thinking about the language. Okay. So this is all fairly well known, especially Kongzi and Bing Li and so forth. And also Dafu. So the second character is sort of fully represented in the first or the other way around, and that's why you just write it once. And it gets trickier here, I think, right? Because then there are multiple possible ways of reading this. And again, here I think the reader cannot just be very spontaneous. It would really help if you know what the text is talking about, and not just be someone who's good at reciting a text, but not really familiar with the content. Because, you know, like with xian, it could be zhi xian or xian ren or zhi ren, or even if you don't see that it's Hewen, it could be xian xian. And, you know, just one of them is meant, and you need to figure it out. These, I guess, are easy. They're just different forms of forming a Hewen, so I'll skip that. And well, here too, that's an interesting case, and I think also needs a bit of flexibility of the reader to understand if you write the full elephant, it's typically more xian, right? If you write only the head of the elephant, and then you have these internal abbreviation marks saying we left out the body, right? Then it's wei, typically. And of course, you have regionally different conventions for that. But then even within one manuscript, like here, the you know, you have 2 very different forms, and they're both the same way. And one is strongly abbreviated. Of course, you know, I'm expecting the typical reader of that community to be familiar with these abbreviations. But again, it's a matter of competence here. The Latin we can leave out. Yeah, it's another complex thing, but I guess I should move on to, that was an interesting one in terms of, I hesitate to talk about it because phonology is involved, but anyway, you need, why I'm showing this is you need to recognize what has been abbreviated, right? And even the abbreviation mark that's integrated in the character had for a long time been overlooked. I think it's a clear thing now, but there was quite a long time when people seem to be confused about it, even after Lin Suqing's dissertation that mentioned it already in the mid-80s. But it took a long time for people to become more familiar with that. So Yeah, because you very seldom find the full phonetic written, and even here we could dispute if it's full. So, and then it just really seemed what also Fuxian seems to reflect, right? That, okay, so Gung is the phonetic, and then Trong is, sorry, Hong is the phonetic, and Trong the significant, and so forth. And yeah, and obviously the actual phonetic is a much better fit, I would assume. I'm cautiously saying here. Okay. This I found a very interesting little phrase to read, because here the reader has to combine different aspects, right? So you have Gong En Wang Gao, and then you read Gao Qiang Men Da Fu, and then Qiang Men Da Fu Yue. And so you need to understand with Da Fu that the same mark is both a He Wen and a Chong Wen Bao, and you need to treat it that way. Yep. That's another thing, not particularly important for what we're doing, but I just wanted to show this, that sometimes characters can be abbreviated extremely strongly, right? So you're just left with this shi component and two more strokes to say, okay, we abbreviate it, and then you have two more strokes here that even look like integrated strokes in the character, but you need to understand that they're not meant to become part of the character. They're an actual Zhong Wen Hao. And then the character can stand for things as different as this Chi Chi and Minzhu Fumo that I worked on, but in Kung Zi Shi Lun, it stands for the bird, Shi, and then it can stand for Nian, via Ren, and all that based on the fact that, and I'm trying to show this is my own clumsy handwriting, that these three really important components of the writing system can look very, very similar, and they're not clearly distinguished. And that means readers were typically expected to figure it out and to know which one is meant. And then in, I still have the wrong thing written here, because in the modern character, it looks like the Gong, but it's really also meant to be the Shi as a phonetic of E, right? Okay. How much time do I have left?
You should be slowly getting to the end.
Okay, slowly, like 5 minutes or so, maybe? Okay, here, one quick thing just to show how I would like to expand this thinking about the collapsing of time, the temporal extension of language in a manuscript. So this is a typical manuscript. Obviously, right, you write from top to bottom of a slip, you go to the next one, and so forth. I took this from Gordian. But then Gordian also has these small manuscripts, the 4 in a smaller site that were titled Yuzhong. And yeah, one of them does pretty much the same thing. And no big deal. But then there are 3 really interesting ones that use space extremely generously. And I was wondering, well, why? So, I mean, the orthodox information that we get typically is the larger manuscripts were for the prestigious text, the smaller ones like Ting, for example, and the smaller ones just commentaries and so forth. Okay. And this leads me to interesting thoughts about that, so that we have such examples. So, the bindings at the outside also have a function of preserving text, right? Because this is where slips tend to break. So if you have them at the outside, you're less likely to lose text, right? Outside of the binding, if you have text there. So, but then it's not just that elaboration, it's also that the characters are so generously spaced and the characters themselves are stretched so much. And I thought, well, I mean, shouldn't people have had a reason for that, right? So the small manuscript, if that means not a big deal, that wouldn't fit. But then the text itself isn't particularly prestigious to me, which of course I couldn't be the judge of. Maybe it was really important, but it just tends to convey mostly terminology, right? Mostly vocabulary. It's not really going very far in having a sort of deeply reflective text. So although scholars really have tried to sort of rearrange the slips and so forth, and get more philosophy into it, but nothing has so far actually convinced me, and I don't want to be arrogant about it. I just feel that often we forget how important just pure lists are for cultures, right? And in China, that's not so established, so we always try to get to something more meaningful, apparently. Another case here of also using very special formats. And that seems to me here too that you could say, well, very impractical when you write in registers, right to left. So I'll show this here in a schematic view a bit more clearly, how it's read. Back to the manuscript now. Okay. So because then you have to fully enroll the manuscript to read it, but I sort of roughly calculated this is an easy one. It's actually about shoulder width, so it's really you can fully hold it, and so easy. But still, why would you do that? So it's not very consistent in reflecting the structure of the text in terms of our ideas of syntax or something in the column breaks. But I think what it does, it definitely for a user foregrounds the structure of the text, right? And why don't all texts do this? I think because often they have a strong internal logic. You don't really need that. And Chinese has enough, particles and so forth. There's a lot of help or regular meter and all that. So you don't need this thing. But what's interesting here is that this text is pretty plain in many parts. And then that puts a lot of responsibility on the reader to do this chunking and to recognize, what are the parts that I need to isolate as one unit. So I want to show a few examples. Again, I'm skipping details of the manuscript because I think it's known to many people. So here I think, yeah, if you really need more meaning, you could read nu neng xi, so rage is capable of whatever, and I don't really buy that. So I think it's just really, it's enraged and cheerful or something, just, antonyms put together, or I put in an at and yet to make it a little bit more meaningful, but that's just an arbitrary choice, right? So I think that's pretty much a list of antonyms, right? And that would be easy for a reader to figure out. I think it's a bit less easy in this part of the same text when you have just words that sort of semantically are grouped together in a really sensible way. But, in the act of reading to make those decisions, I think is asking a bit much of the reader. So writing in column really helps. Of course, it stretches the text. You have to use more material, but it's helpful, I think, not just for recitation to an audience, but also for your own sort of memorization of the concepts. And then there are two more manuscripts that distribute in part verbatim the same text in different ways, but also use registers. This is the one with an actual title kept in the Yulu Shu Yuan, and now there's a new one in Beida, where other text is added. It's also interesting that the registers are not a very strong requirement, apparently. At some point, all these three manuscripts then start to write the columns in the conventional way and then move on to other content. So what I am assuming, therefore, is that really the nature of this text and the plainer it gets, the reader maybe needs more help. And then you get these special format features that help chunking the text. And my last remark now is, oh no, wow, this one is really exciting. So it hasn't really been fully published yet. So you read A1, you start in the center and you start with something really meaningful, right? 原以生方 正式之长. So I tried to emulate the rhyme a little bit. It's clumsy English, but off the rounds make a square, rules of government affairs, and so forth. So it seems that there is a really strong claim that the perfection and roundness of heaven sort of gets translated into those political ideas, into the squareness here on earth, squareness, correctness, and so forth, that you learn in those sort of in this didactic text. And so you read it this way, you really go those rounds. So it's a very embodied experience of the logic promised in the title or at the beginning, in the center. But it seems, and here we would need the fully published text, that there's also this gradual expansion of the explanation. And then it goes from, as I showed here with B, because I had the text in an article, you go from B1 to C1 to B1 and so forth, right? So you have alternative reading methods. Okay. And my really last remark wanted to be that all this made me rethink a little bit what it might mean that you write Jing on a very large format and you write the T on this. because maybe it also has something to do with, well, the Jing manuscripts, if they're that big, they're not necessarily ideal for reading, but probably because people were expected to know a lot of that anyway. So you honor the text, you represent it visually, but then, you know, the commentary stuff that you really need to learn, where you need help in understanding what those texts say, because you haven't learned them yet, right? They're written in formats that give you more help to understand the text and structure it and actually use it for live reading or so. That's where I should stop. Thank you.